I did not know what thunder truly was until the sky over Hive Tertius forgot how to exist, because thunder in the Imperium is usually mechanical, the roar of macro cannons, the shriek of atmospheric processors, the constant grinding noise of industry choking a dying world. But this was different. This was a silence so absolute it made my thoughts echo inside my skull. And I remember standing on the upper observation tiers as a sanctioned tasked with recording the closing days of a routine compliance campaign. Watching the polluted clouds congeal into shapes no meteorological engine could explain, spiraling inward like a wound in reality, while the Auspex screens behind me filled with impossible readings that caused the tech priests to mutter binaric prayers under their breath. And then the clouds split, not torn by bombardment or warp breach, but parted as if something older than this age demanded passage. And what fell through them did not burn like debris nor scream like a drop pod. It simply descended wrapped in living lightning. Blue-white arcs snapping outward and upward at the same time, defying every law the Mechanicus had ever catalogued. And when it struck the ash plains beyond the hive walls, the ground heaved as if the planet itself flinched, shockwaves rattling the cathedral spires and sending workers and soldiers alike to their knees. And in that moment I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sensation I would later recognize as awe stripped of faith, raw and terrifying, because awe has no place in the Imperium unless it is directed upward toward the Emperor. And yet this came from elsewhere, from something that felt personal, as though the universe itself had cleared its throat to announce a guest. And lightning erupted from the impact site in a column so bright it painted the hive city in stark blue shadow, every Gothic arch and rusted buttress etched like a corpse under lumens. And I heard one of the Imperial fists beside me tighten his grip on his bolter, ceramite fingers creaking, and over the squad vox came a whisper that was not a prayer, not a code, but a single human word spoken like a sin: God. And I remember thinking how strange it was that even an Astartes gene-forged to know no fear could still recognize something that did not belong to war but to myth. And as the thunder rolled outward, not echoing but overlapping itself like laughter across a hall of stone, I realized with a slow, sinking dread that whatever had arrived was not of the warp, because the warp announces itself with madness and corruption, with whispers and hunger. But this arrival felt clean in the most unsettling way, like a blade drawn across filth. And within minutes the alarms howled across the hive, defense lasers tracking a target that no longer moved, and orders cascaded down the chain of command demanding containment, analysis, classification, while I stood frozen, recording skull hovering at my shoulder, knowing with absolute certainty that classification was already impossible, because the Imperium survives by naming things and reducing them to categories, and this thing had arrived carrying a name the Imperium had forgotten how to use. And as thunderhawks lifted from their bays and armored columns rolled out through the ash storms, I could not shake the feeling that we were not responding to an invasion, but intruding upon a story that had begun long before humanity ever reached the stars. And when the first pick feeds came back from the crater, showing a lone figure standing upright at its center, unarmored, unbowed, holding a hammer that crackled with contained storms, I felt my stomach drop, because the figure did not look triumphant or wrathful, but confused, turning slowly beneath a poisoned sky as if searching for constellations that were no longer there. And in that confusion I sensed the true danger, not that he would attack us, but that he would understand us. And in the grim darkness of the far future, understanding is far more heretical than hatred. They took us out at first shift, though the word dawn meant nothing on Hive Tertius, where the sun was a dull smear behind layers of chemical cloud. And I walked behind the Imperial fists as their boots crushed centuries of ash into finer powder, my recording skull humming softly as it struggled to filter the static that now saturated the air. Because the closer we drew to the impact site, the more the world seemed unwilling to behave, compasses spinning, auspex, needles trembling as if afraid to settle. And I remember the smell first, not the usual tamps of promethium or ozone, but something clean and sharp like rain striking hot stone, a scent so alien to this dead world that it made my chest ache with memories I did not possess. And when the crater finally came into view, it was not the jagged wound I expected, but a smooth basin of vitrified earth, glassy and faintly glowing as though the planet itself had been struck by a forge hammer wielded by a god. And at its center he stood tall even among Astartes berammed, despite the cold red cloak hanging in tatters that fluttered against an invisible wind. And in his right hand he held the source of all our dread, a squat hammer etched with runes that crawled when viewed through magnification, lightning pulsing through it like blood through veins. And he turned as we approached, not aggressively, but with the wary posture of a warrior who has woken on a battlefield he does not recognize. And his eyes met mine for the briefest moment, blue and impossibly alive, and in them I saw not the emptiness of a demon nor the cold calculation of a Xenos overlord, but confusion layered over grief, and Captain Verald ordered the formation. Holt bolters raised in practiced unity, yet no shots were fired because the man spoke, his voice rolling across the crater like distant thunder, asking in a tongue none of us recognized where he was, why the sky was poisoned, and why the people here hid behind walls of iron and fear. And the translators lagged for a heartbeat before catching up, spitting out words that made no sense in the context of our age. And when Verald identified us as warriors of the Imperium, of manservants of the God Emperor, the stranger's expression tightened, his grip on the hammer, flexing lightning flaring brighter for an instant, and he laughed, not mockingly, but with a bitter edge that carried the weight of long memory, saying he had knelt before kings and gods alike, and had learned that divinity was often just another mask for cruelty. And the Space Marines bristled at that, fingers twitching on triggers, yet still they did not fire, because something in the stranger's presence made the act feel obscene, like executing a storm for existing. And he named himself then, slowly, as if testing whether the universe would accept the sound. Thor Odinson, son of a father long dead, protector of realms that had burned while he fought elsewhere. And I felt the word son echo inside my skull, because the Imperium has no sons of gods, only tools and martyrs. And Thor looked upon our banners and purity seals with a mixture of curiosity and sadness, asking why humanity clothed itself in the symbols of chains, why its warriors spoke of duty without joy. And when a nervous guardsman broke ranks and fell to his knees, calling Thor a savior, an angel sent by the Emperor, Thor stepped back as if struck, his face hardening, and he told the man to stand, to never kneel to someone who bleeds. And I saw in that moment the first fracture form in the rigid certainty that holds the Imperium together. Because belief is our greatest weapon and our greatest weakness, and Thor did not want it. And as the Ecclesiarchy's advance elements arrived, robed priests chanting litanies of denunciation, the air grew thick with tension. Accusations of heresy hurled like knives, and when a sanctioned psyker reached out with his mind to probe Thor's nature, he collapsed screaming, blood streaming from his nose as he babbled of storms, beyond storms, of halls of gold shattered in void fire of a being whose essence did not flow from the warp, but ran parallel to it like a river that refused to join the sea. And Thor knelt beside the fallen psyker with genuine concern, laying a hand upon his brow, murmuring words that sounded like comfort, and the screaming stopped, leaving only sobs. And that mercy terrified the priests more than any act of violence could have, because mercy without sanction is rebellion. And as orders crackled over the Vox demanding containment, I watched Thor lift his gaze to the hive city, to the miles of stacked misery and industry, and his jaw clenched as he whispered something I barely caught, a lament for a people who had built their own prison and crowned it a throne. And when Captain Verald finally spoke again, his voice lower now, asking Thor to submit for the good of mankind, Thor met his gaze and said quietly that he had submitted once before, had obeyed laws written by those who feared change, and it had cost him everything. And as thunder rolled overhead despite the absence of natural storms, I realized we stood at the edge of an impossible choice, because Thor was not attacking, not corrupting, not conquering, he was simply standing there, asking us who we were. And in the Imperium of man, questions are the first step toward damnation. They did not imprison him because the word prison implies walls that can hold what is inside them, and instead, Thor was escorted, watched, surrounded at all times by armed reverence and armed fear, moved through the lower reaches of Hive Tertius, where the spires gave way to manufacturing blocks and habstacks, packed so tightly together that sunlight such as it was had never touched the ground, and I followed as close as I was permitted, my status as remembrancer, a thin shield against the suspicion of the Ecclesiarchy and the cold scrutiny of the Inquisition as observers. And everywhere we went the people felt him before they saw him, heads lifting, work slowing, the endless mechanical rhythm of production faltering, as if the machines themselves sensed something out of place. And whispers spread through the crowds like static, because Thor walked without armor, without augmetics, without the sanctioned symbols of authority, and yet the air around him hummed with restrained power, his footsteps leaving faint cracks in ferrocrete, his presence pressing against the soul rather than the flesh. And when workers fell to their knees he stopped, again and again, lifting them gently, telling them in halting Gothic that he was no savior, no angel, no envoy of their emperor, and that they should stand because no god worthy of respect demands submission from the broken. And each time he said it I saw the priests stiffen, fingers tightening around their censers, because the Imperium survives on ritualized despair, on convincing its people that suffering is holy, and Thor's words were poison to that idea. And yet when a Hablock riot broke out as our bites attempted to disperse the crowd with shock mauls and gunfire, It was Thor who moved first, stepping between baton and flesh, catching a descending maul in his bare hand and gently pushing it aside. The lightning round him flaring not in rage but warning. And when the Arbite's captain raised his pistol in panic, Thor spoke his name before he could fire, not through psychic intrusion but by reading the sigil on his armor, and said that killing frightened people was not law but cowardice. And the captain lowered his weapon, shaking. In that moment, brief and undocumented, was more dangerous than any open rebellion, because it showed that authority could be defied without consequence. And as we moved deeper, chaos cultists sensed him too, drawn like insects to a storm front, emerging from shadowed alleys chanting the names of powers that gnaw at the edges of reality. And I watched them rush him in a frenzy of blades and corrupted flesh, only to be stopped by thunder that cracked the air itself. Thor's hammer moving in wide, devastating arcs that shattered bodies and banished warp things in flashes of light so intense my recording skull overloaded. And the horror was not in the violence, which was swift and almost merciful, but in the way the warp recoiled, reality snapping back into place behind each blow as if relieved. And afterward Thor stood amidst the aftermath, breathing hard, not exultant but weary, staring at the dead cultists with something like pity, murmuring that he had seen this before, mortals selling themselves to promises that never loved them, and that pity unsettled me more than his power, because the Imperium teaches us to hate our enemies until they are less than human. But Thor mourned even those who had damned themselves. And that night, atop a ruined manufactorum stack overlooking miles of flickering lumen strips, I found him alone, sitting with his hammer resting across his knees like a tired companion, staring up at a sky that held no familiar stars. And he spoke without turning, saying that the heavens here were wrong, not merely distant but wounded. And he told me of Asgard in fragments, of golden halls and laughter echoing across bridges of light, of a final battle where gods fell screaming beneath a sky torn open by fire, and of a moment after, a fall through endless darkness where even thunder was swallowed. And as he spoke, I realized he believed himself dead, cast into this age as some cruel afterlife. And when I asked him why he stayed, why he did not simply tear open the sky again and leave, he was silent for a long time before saying that a warrior does not abandon a battlefield while innocents still bleed. And that answer chilled me, because it meant Thor had already chosen to involve himself in a war he could not win. And by dawn, the Ecclesiarchy declared him a false god, issuing proclamations that any who followed the Thunderer would be burned as heretics, while in the shadows the Inquisition debated whether he was a demon of unprecedented subtlety or a weapon beyond comprehension. And sanctioned psychers attempted again to pierce his nature, collapsing one by one with visions of storms beyond the warp, of a power source that did not hunger, did not bargain, did not corrupt. And the fear that spread through the ruling strata was palpable, because the Imperium can fight demons, can fight Xenos, can even fight gods if they fit into known categories, but Thor did not. And as word spread of worlds beyond Hive Tertius, where Orcwas had been broken by a lone red-cloaked figure wreathed in lightning, and of demon incursions dispersed by thunder that drowned out the whispers of the warp, I began to understand the deeper horror of his presence. Not that he brought destruction, but that he represented an alternative, a vision of power that protected rather than consumed, and in a galaxy built on the idea that suffering is inevitable, the suggestion that it is not is the most destabilizing force imaginable. And as Thor rose from the edge of the manufactorum and looked out over the endless city one last time before departing to another war zone, his expression was not triumphant but heavy with the weight of responsibility. And I realized with a slow, creeping dread that the Imperium would never forgive him for making its people dream. The Inquisition arrived not with fanfare but with gravity, the kind that bends everything around it without needing to announce itself. And I felt it before I saw the black ships blotting out the upper skies, their silhouettes like accusations against the clouds. Because where the Inquisition goes, truth is not sought but decided. And Thor sensed it too, standing still in the center of a shattered parade square as servo skulls scattered and crowds were driven back at gunpoint. His posture relaxed yet wary, like a warrior who has learned that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who charges screaming but the one who smiles and takes notes. And when Inquisitor Lord Kalen Voss finally emerged, draped in sigils of absolute authority, his eyes cold augmetics that word softly as they catalogued Thor piece by piece, there was no immediate command to fire, no dramatic condemnation, only questions delivered in a tone so polite it felt obscene, asking what Thor was, where his power originated, and why he had not yet declared fealty to the God-Emperor of mankind. And Thor listened patiently, leaning on his hammer, lightning contained but restless, and replied that he had sworn fealty once to a father who believed order was more important than compassion. and that oath had ended in fire and death, and the Inquisitor smiled thinly at that, because he heard not a warning but a challenge, and signaled to his psychers, who formed a ritual circle etched with wards and sigils, their minds reaching out in unison to grasp Thor's essence, and the moment they touched him, the world screamed, not audibly but spiritually, a pressure wave that sent me to my knees clutching my skull. Visions flashing through my mind of endless storms raging across void realms untouched by the warp, of a vast tree of realities splintered and burning, of a hammer flying through stars like a promise that refused to die. And the psychers collapsed one by one, blood streaming from eyes and ears as they babbled incoherently about a power that did not bargain, did not hunger, did not whisper, and the Inquisitor's smile vanished then, replaced by something far more dangerous, uncertainty, because the Inquisition can tolerate almost anything except the unknown, and Voss declared Thor a singular anomaly, potentially apocalyptic, to be studied, bound, or destroyed as necessity dictated, and at that proclamation the air changed, thunder rolling low and continuous, Thor's grip tightening on Mjolnir as he asked a single question, quiet and devastating, asking how many billions had died in the Imperium's pursuit of control, and the Inquisitor answered without hesitation that suffering was the price of survival, that humanity endured because it accepted cruelty as currency. And Thor shook his head slowly, saying he had seen that philosophy before, had watched it hollow gods into tyrants and realms into graveyards. And when the order to open fire was finally given, it felt anticlimactic. Lozbolts and plasma washing over Thor in a storm of sanctioned violence that bent around him. Lightning flaring outward in a dome that vaporized incoming fire. And for a heartbeat I saw Space Marines hesitate again, because even they could sense the wrongness of executing someone who was not attacking. And that hesitation was enough for the warp to notice, because far away, beyond the veil, the ruinous powers stirred, drawn by a presence that denied them. And I later learned that in the realm of chaos, Khorne roared in fury at a warrior who spilled blood without worship, that Tzeentch's schemes tangled and frayed around a fate that did not obey probability, that Slaanesh recoiled from a soul too burdened by duty to indulge, and that Nurgle alone watched with something like curiosity, sensing a resilience born not of decay but of endurance. And as a demon incursion tore open the sky above the city, clawing its way into reality in response to the psychic shock, Thor turned from the Imperials without striking them and leaped skyward into the rift, hammer first, thunder colliding with warfire in a spectacle so violent it fractured the clouds into screaming color, and I watched him fight things no human mind should comprehend, each blow closing the tier a fraction more, each roar echoing across, the hive-like defiance given voice, until with a final, titanic strike the rift sealed, leaving only scorched air and falling ash. And Thor descended slowly, cloak torn, blood running from a dozen wounds that steamed with lightning, and he looked not at the cheering civilians nor the stunned soldiers, but at the Inquisitor, telling him that if this galaxy survived by feeding its children to monsters, then it did not deserve to survive unchanged. And in that moment I understood why the Imperium feared him. Because Thor was not here to conquer or corrupt, he was here to judge, not as a god but as a witness, and there is nothing more terrifying to a regime built on lies than someone who remembers the time before them. And as the Inquisitor ordered a retreat under the guise of strategic reassessment, already planning subtler ways to neutralize the Thunderer, Thor turned away, lightning fading to a low hum, and I felt the weight of inevitability settle over us all. Because this confrontation had proven one thing beyond doubt, that the Imperium could not control. Thor could not easily kill him and could not allow him to remain. And in the grim darkness of the far future, anything that cannot be categorized becomes an enemy. And as Thor walked back into the war-torn streets to stand between civilians and the next horror, I realized with a hollow ache that he was now at war not with chaos, not with Xenos, but with the very idea of the Imperium itself. By the time the order was given, it had already been decided for centuries. Because the Imperium does not change its mind. It merely delays the inevitable behind layers of bureaucracy and prayer. And so Thor became a problem to be solved rather than a miracle to be understood. His movements tracked by astropaths who could barely perceive him. His battles quietly reclassified. His name scrubbed from public records even as it spread faster through rumor than any sanctioned sermon. And I followed the trail of thunder across 3 systems, arriving always after the storm. 2 worlds where Ork was lay broken in fields of smoking wreckage split by lightning that had melted steel like wax, to shrine worlds where demon incursions had collapsed inward as if struck by a fist from outside reality. And everywhere the pattern was the same, Thor arriving alone, fighting without command, refusing banners, refusing worship, leaving behind survivors who looked at the Imperium's forces with new, dangerous questions in their eyes. And that was when the Ecclesiarchy declared him not merely heretical but corrosive, a spiritual contagion that eroded faith simply by existing, and the Inquisition, in rare agreement, concluded that Thor's continued presence posed an existential threat, not because he would overthrow the Imperium, but because he would expose it. And so a plan was formed, quiet and absolute, the kind of plan that ends civilizations without ever being named. And the chosen instrument was Exterminatus, not against Thor directly, but against the idea of him, a demonstration that no being, no matter how powerful or benevolent, could stand between humanity and its ordained suffering. And Hive Tertius was selected as the stage, declared irredeemable after a manufactured surge in cult activity, its billions of souls reduced to a statistic. And when the fleet translated into orbit and the cyclonic torpedoes were armed, I felt something tear inside me, because I knew Thor would come, and he did, appearing in the upper atmosphere like a falling star climbing upward, lightning screaming around him as he took in the sight of the fleet, the targeting arrays locking onto a city he had walked through, spoken to, tried to save. And when the first torpedo fell, he did not hesitate, hurling his hammer with a roar that shook the void, Mjolnir striking the warhead dead center and detonating it in a blossom of blue-white light so bright it cast shadows across the hulls of battle barges. And one by one he struck them down, flying faster than Auspex could track, lightning lancing between weapons as if the storm itself had chosen a side. And I watched from a command deck as admirals screamed orders that went unanswered, because even void shields mean nothing when struck by something that does not recognize them as barriers. And the horror of that moment was not in the destruction, but in the realization that Thor was doing the impossible for the simplest of reasons, because people were still alive down there. And when the final torpedo detonated harmlessly in orbit and the fleet hung stunned and silent above a world it had meant to erase, Thor hovered before them, bloodied cloak in tatters, lightning dim but unbroken, and he shouted, his voice carrying through the void and over every open channel, demanding to know how many times humanity would burn itself to feel safe. And there was no answer, because the Imperium has never learned how to speak to those who refuse to kneel. And in that silence, the truth settled like ash, that Thor had crossed the one line that could not be uncrossed. He had denied the Imperium its ultimate authority, and from that moment on his fate was sealed, because even gods are permitted only until they interfere with policy. And as if summoned by that defiance, the warp convulsed, chaos seizing upon the psychic shock of billions nearly sacrificed, and a rift tore open above the hive, larger than any before, a screaming wound in reality that vomited demons in numbers no garrison could hope to contain. And I saw Thor look at it, exhaustion warring with resolve, and I knew he understood what this was. Not an accident, but consequence, the universe correcting itself in the cruelest way it knew. And without waiting for thanks or permission, he turned and flew into the storm, alone, hammer blazing brighter than it ever had before. And what followed was less a battle than a collision of principles, thunder against madness, order born of responsibility against chaos born of hunger. And even as the sky burned and the city shook, Thor fought not to win but to hold, each blow sealing the rift a fraction more, each wound he took a testament to the cost of standing between humanity and its own choices. And I felt then the deepest horror of all, because Thor was not meant for this galaxy, not built for endless war without hope, and yet he was sacrificing himself anyway, because that is what heroes do when they have no one left to save them from themselves. And as the rift finally began to collapse, sucking demons back into screaming unreality, Thor drove his hammer into its heart and vanished in a blinding detonation that silenced the sky, leaving only falling ash and a city that lived. And in the aftermath, the Imperium declared victory, rewriting the narrative to claim the Emperor's protection had prevailed, omitting the god who had bled for them. And as I stood amid the ruins, listening to survivors whisper of thunder and a red cloak disappearing into light, I realized the Imperium would never hunt Thor openly again, because to acknowledge him now would be to admit that another way had existed, and that was the one sin it could never forgive. And though the galaxy returned to its wars and lies, something had shifted, because once you have seen a god choose mercy over dominion, you can never fully believe in a throne built on bones again. Long after the thunder faded, after the sky stitched itself closed and the Imperium resumed its grinding march as if nothing anomalous had ever occurred, I was summoned to testify before a chamber whose walls were older than the city it orbited, a place where silence itself felt monitored. And there I was told, with calm certainty, that Thor Odinson had never existed, that the destruction of the Exterminator's torpedoes had been a miraculous malfunction, that the warp rift had been sealed by the Emperor's unseen hand, and that any deviation from this narrative would be treated as deliberate treason. And I nodded, because survival in the Imperium often requires agreement with lies too large to fight. Yet even as I complied, I knew something had irreversibly changed, because the galaxy remembers things the Administratum cannot catalogue, and whispers spread in places no Inquisitor could fully reach, of a red-cloaked figure seen one final time on the edge of real space, drifting between stars, wounded but unbroken, carried not by rage or ambition but by exhaustion and purpose intertwined. And in my dreams I saw him falling again, not into darkness this time but into something quieter, a vast emptiness beyond the warp where even the ruinous powers dared not look, and I wondered if that was death for a god, or merely rest. And as years passed and I aged and my hands trembled too much to write clean script, I realized that Thor's true legacy was not the battles he fought or the worlds he saved, but the silence he left behind, because in that silence there lingered a question no sermon could smother, a question that crept into the thoughts of guardsmen staring at the stars between deployments, of hive workers pausing at manufactorum windows they were not supposed to look out of even some Astartes who remembered the hesitation in their hands when ordered to fire upon a being who had not struck them. And that question was simple and catastrophic, asking whether strength must always demand obedience, whether survival truly required the abandonment of mercy, whether the Emperor himself, entombed upon his throne, had once been closer to Thor than to the corpse guard he had become. And that question festered quietly, not enough to spark rebellion, not enough to be named heresy, but enough to weaken the foundations of absolute certainty upon which the Imperium balanced its decaying weight. And I sometimes imagined Thor watching from whatever distant realm had claimed him, seeing a galaxy that could not be saved by a single god no matter how strong, understanding at last that his tragedy was not failure but incompatibility, because he came from a myth where heroes mattered, and this was an age where only systems endured, grinding hope into fuel. And yet even here, even now, storms still behave strangely on certain worlds. Lightning striking without cause, thunder rolling beneath clear skies, and survivors speak of feeling watched over for a moment, just long enough to stand back up. And I know these stories will never be written into official histories, will never be carved into marble or recited from pulpits. But they will persist in the only place the Imperium cannot fully control: memory. And as I record these final words in a hidden archive, knowing they may never be heard, I do so not as an act of rebellion but of remembrance, because in the grim darkness of the far future there is only war, yes, but there was also once a god who arrived not to rule, not to conquer, but to stand between humanity and its own annihilation, and that, more than any demon or Xenos or heretic, is what truly terrified the Imperium. And as my life draws to a close beneath a sky forever scarred by industry, I find myself listening for thunder that may never come again, hoping, irrationally, that somewhere beyond the veil of lies and war, Thor Odinson still carries his hammer, still believes that even a doomed galaxy is worth defending, because if even a god can choose compassion in a universe built on cruelty, then perhaps the darkest heresy of all is the belief that things must remain exactly as they are.